Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to our meeting this afternoon, which comes after our AGM. It's been our practice to hold a meeting with the, in conjunction with the AGM, some more general interest, so that we can discuss air quality in a practical but luckily interesting manner. And we've tended to invite people from outside the air quality community to give us their perspective. It is all too easy for us as air quality professionals to be a little bit insular, perhaps. And also, I think we often complain within the profession that we don't get enough traction with our own subject amongst the general public and elected representatives. So one of the inspirations behind today's meeting is to look to address that in some way from our point of view by inviting two elected representatives to speak to us this afternoon. Very pleased to welcome Joan, who, as you know, is the chair of the EAC, and Stephen Knight, who's an assembly member in London. And we're also going to be joined by Ruth Calderwood from the City of London, from a local authority perspective. And what we'd like to do this afternoon, with your help and the speaker's help, is to have a discussion on how we see air quality at the present time in the UK and what we might do to improve it. And I'd like to indulge you first of all by restating the IAQM's position on many of these topics, using the submission that we made to the EAC as a template, because that does represent our position at the current time. So, after I've had my little say on our behalf, I'd like to invite Ruth to speak, and then Joan and Stephen, and I'm then hoping that we'll have a collective discussion. So, if you have any burning questions for individual speakers, it might help perhaps if you just save them up to the end, and then we can address those questions collectively. If that works for everyone? Good. Right. Let's begin then. As I said, I would like to just set our position and make some observations as we see it on these topic headings here, which you can see. So I'll just run through them in turn. Sorry, you can see this disadvantage there. Yeah, let's put you there. First of all, where are we at the moment? I think it's probably fair to say, at least I think it's fair to say, that we've stalled a little bit in recent times, certainly in comparison with where we have come from, as measured in decades. When I began working in air quality many, many years ago, the issues were rather different. Lead in air was a problem. We solved that. SO2 and smoke was still a problem. Largely solved that through essentially the use of natural gas, but also obviously pumping down on domestic coal combustion. The smoke and SO2 bubbler network was very large when I began my career. It's of course non-existent now. We've taken sulphur out of power stations pretty much. SO2 is no longer a serious problem, even though there are still pockets of acidification in ecosystems. But whereas when I started, urban air quality was a minority issue, it is perhaps now the issue, and of course dominated by the effects of road transport. So that's very much where the focus is now. A point we made to the committee, and whenever we have the opportunity, is we have no air quality strategy since 2007. And indeed, the 2007 document itself was a very modest advance on the previous edition in 2000. We find, as an industry, we find that very puzzling, and we're not sure how you can tackle air quality at the national level without having a clear strategy about how you're going to improve matters. I commented earlier on some of the successes we've had in air quality, and I think it's undeniable that many of those were driven by regulation. Most of the improvements needed a regulatory impetus in some senses. That's actually, it seems to me, quite unfashionable at the moment, and perhaps that's a pity. I think the aversion to regulation is potentially a barrier, and indeed possibly there are some missed opportunities there. Many of the drivers for improving air quality, of course, originates in Europe with the Commission. Ambient air quality directives, for example, largely predated national objectives. Emission ceilings on a national basis, emission standards for vehicles. These are driven by directives in the first place. And speaking of emission directives, we're at a critical point now where we are relying for the NO2 problem very much on Euro 6 working. Previous emission standards clearly have not, for various reasons. Everything depends on Euro 6 for NO2 improvement. And whilst we have this focus on NO2, there are other issues as well which we should not forget. NO2 is clearly important, and the evidence is hardening with regard to health effects. But it seems to me that the driver for that is as much to do with legislation and legal compliance as it is with an attempt to improve air quality for its public health benefits. In the USA, for example, the equivalent standard for nitrogen dioxide is 100 micrograms per cubic metre. So, guess what? They don't pay that much attention to NO2 as a pollutant that focuses on particles and ozone. For us, we have arguably quite a tight standard of 40, considering the health evidence, and that's driving legal compliance, which is a tremendous stimulus, of course, and I don't in any way obviously object to that. I think that the fact that the threat of the fines hangs over the UK is a very positive thing, because it actually stimulated some action in courses where it was previously absent. But we have a standard, a limited value rather for PM2.5, which arguably, relative to the public health effects, is rather weak. And in consequence, we talk now about air quality and air pollution being bad, but we actually use that as a synonym for NO2, and possibly ignoring PM2.5. And can I draw your attention to something? 59, what's that about? It is what the government through DEFRA thinks will be our national emission in 2030, which I find a bit worrying, because that's actually roughly where it is now, and it's projected to be an increase relative to 2020 and 25. So the one pollutant that we know pretty much in a nailed-on way is responsible for premature mortality. We are saying that we cannot, under government policies, reduce, whereas for NOx, although it's a problem now, at least we have a pathway towards reducing emissions. I don't think this is currently getting enough attention, and of course the Commission has proposed stricter national emissions, and it's not clear to me what our policy is or strategy for reducing PM2.5. I go back to my earlier point on strategy. Okay, so, speaking of government, what's going on? We did make some observations to the committee on various government departments. I think they're pretty much self-evident, and no one will be greatly surprised. DEFRA is the department with responsibility for air quality, but yet has little direct influence on the levers which can improve air quality. It also has few resources. Its current focus seems to be on reducing regulations, so-called red tape challenge. Currently there are proposals for the Clean Air Act and various other antiquated pieces of legislation which we would fully support being reformed. But, and here's the but, we think it's a lost opportunity for making some other improvements in that area rather than just bundling them together. Small combustion is potentially a problem in big cities, and a neglect of what we could have used that opportunity rather to improve air quality management in this regard. It's also the parent for the Environment Agency, which, as we know, is shrinking resources and therefore finds it increasingly difficult to regulate industrial emissions. The FT, of course, is a department which very much does have influence on one of the major emission sources, and I'm perhaps being a bit cheeky here in this statement, saying it's relying merely on Euro standards and ultra-low emission vehicles, but it's hard to discern any other really serious active policy right now. I say that's slightly cheeky because I came from a meeting at the FT this morning, so I know that some people are looking at other ways forward, but as things stand, that's pretty much where the FT lie in terms of looking to change things. DCLG is an important player, I think, and our planning system is arguably critical in determining long-term air quality. And we've seen, I think, the withdrawal, in some senses, of DCLG from the topic through the removal of guidance which helped us in the planning process to understand how to make air quality better. So we have a very loose framework at the moment which has some laudable objectives, but it's less obvious how we're going to get there using the planning system. Local authorities are given the challenge of improving air quality, but of course they are handicapped by, again, not being in control of many of the things that influence air quality on their patch. Not too long ago, proposals were made on local air quality management, which I think it's fair to say the profession looks dimly on, and we welcome the fact that DEFRA was thinking again on that, and we certainly would not support any dismemberment of the IAQM structure, although we do, of course, seek improvement and refinement. And obviously, we don't think fines should be paid by local authorities. Road transport, clearly a key issue. As I mentioned, Euro 6 is vital here. And having thought about this subject a lot professionally in the last year or two, one of the things that bothers me a lot is the incredible lack of knowledge on real-world performance of Euro 6 vehicles. Now, I know they're new and they haven't come on the market yet, so it's hard to test them, but this country does not seem to be committing resources to real-world measurements. So we don't actually know whether this vital change in, or potential change in emissions is really going to take place. But we do know that Euros 3, 4 and 5 certainly not works, particularly for diesel engines, both for passenger cars and heavy goods vehicles. So we've got a lot of optimism at the moment in our emissions projections, but that really does depend on this thing working. And the jury's obviously out on that one at the moment. We'd like to understand that better. Low emission zones are very much talked about as a means of getting to what we want. And maybe this is personally being not IAQM, think that they're obviously a good thing, but we must remember what they do is merely accelerate what would have happened anyway at some cost. So I think it's slightly dangerous to see them as the complete answer to our problems, although they may be part of the solution. Public health. Of course, we know that air pollution, or more exactly at the moment, PM2.5, is responsible for a lot of premature mortality. The number is often repeated amongst our community and our circles. But does it really drive policy, or is it, as I said earlier, merely the need to seek compliance with limit values? I'm not sure that yet that's enough of a driver. But if it isn't, why isn't it, given the fact that we know the scale of the public health burden is at least on par with, say, obesity and certainly passive smoking? And we've had the change in public health function by taking out of the NHS into local authorities. That should be a good thing, but as yet we're not quite sure what the result is going to be in practical terms. I'd like to be positive about that, but we need to understand. Admittedly, it's, as Sir Terry told me early days. And we, of course, the citizens, are not absent from this. The public is generally aware that air pollution is a bad thing, but I don't perceive that it translates into sufficient momentum for serious action to improve air quality. Governments in a democracy need to understand that the public have an appetite for change and are willing to make those changes. It's not just about the external threat. Societies, I think we're very bad at dealing with what is in effect an internal threat and perhaps very good at external threats. If the threat to air quality is perceived as external, a new source in your area, lots of people protest about it. Not so many people protest about the general mass of people driving around in, say, diesel vehicles. We are aware that DEFRA is supporting some work on communication and how air quality is understood. And I actually think that's quite critical, and understanding the psychology of this is at least as important as understanding the science. And that's me done, so I'll move on. Ruth, take it forward.
Thanks very much, Roger, for the introduction. So I'm Ruth Calderwood, and I work for the City of London Corporation on their quality policy, and I've been in that role for quite a few years now, so I have an overall fairly good understanding of what's been working and what's not been working in terms of improving air quality and helping people to reduce exposure. I've been asked to talk to you about what I think we should be doing to improve air quality. And firstly, I want to, for those of you who aren't familiar, give you an idea of the levels of pollution that we have in central London. Nitrogen dioxide, as you know, we've got an annual average unit value there of 40 micrograms per metre cube that we're supposed to meet. And we have background levels of around 45 in the square mile on the roadside, about 120. Obviously it's roadsides. So there's quite a bit, there is quite a big difference there, but there is quite a long way for us to go to achieve that 40 microgram. The map that I've included there is modelled concentrations of nitrogen dioxide for the square mile, and it's colour-coded, darker colour, the higher the concentration. So you can see a clear correlation with roads, and that's because, as we know, the majority of NO2 is So for PM10, we don't fare quite so badly on that. We meet the average unit value, but the daily mean, we meet that at background sites, but we're not at roadside. Our business roadside site tends to exceed that unit value. And for PM2.5, there are two limits to that. We've got 25 to meet by 2015, and then 20 micrograms to meet by 2020. And our background concentrations are around about 50 micrograms per cubed, and roadside can reach around about 20. So it doesn't look quite so bad for meeting with the limit value for that. But if you bear in mind that the World Health Organization guidelines are actually 10, I wonder whether going forward with our public health activities, we're going to have to start focusing on that a bit more and start thinking what additional action we can take to reduce PM2.5 further. So pollution levels, as Roger said, over the last 10 years or so haven't really changed that much. It's taken quite a long time for us to reduce levels of nitrogen dioxide and fine particles. And I think it's going to take a good few years yet before we meet the limit values in central London. So what I wanted to look at briefly with you was how we can reduce the impact on health now on the public, because it is a public health issue and it's a fairly significant one in London. people often aren't aware of that, but there are things that we should be doing to help people reduce their exposure. And the main thing we could do, obviously, is provide information to the public. I've given a couple of examples of things that we're doing with vulnerable people. We're working with Arts, Health, NHS Trust, and getting messages out to their patients that suffer from cardiovascular, cardiopulmonary, and also respiratory disease. So we're trying to target the people that need information most. And we're also working with GLA on their Clean Air for Schools programme to reach messages out to children who have respiratory problems, so we can send alerts to our schools to let them know that pollution levels are high. In addition to that, we do alerts to the whole population. During pollution incidents, we have our City Air app that King's College London developed for us. And that has tailored messages for different users like cyclists, pedestrians, joggers. And I do feel that we're doing that quite locally. We also have air text across London, but that would be helped by a national campaign so that people understood the messages. We weren't just all individually going out to try and reach people and replicating the effort. If we had a national campaign, people would actually, I think, be more likely to seek out the information themselves. In addition to notifying people when we have high pollution incidents, I personally think we have a responsibility to let people know that they should be reducing exposure every day. And there's simple things that they can do that. We've been working with businesses to get messages out to employees in the city through our City Air programme, highlighting lower pollution routes, and just simple things like walking away from the curbside. And we've also been doing quite a lot of work with our residents on the citizen science programme, doing personal exposure monitoring, and I think some members of the Audit Committee actually did that as well. People walk around with packs monitoring PM 2.5, so it tracks the pollution as we move around the city. And I've just included a couple of maps to show you what that can look like. We have residents in Barbican Centre, we have about 70 households involved in this. They've been monitoring nitrogen dioxide on their balconies, but they've also been doing the personal exposure monitoring. And these dots are all individual readings as they walk or cycle or move around the area. On this particular map, we have readings taken in February of this year. The dark green colour is the lower level of concentration, and the white and pink are high levels. It tends to reflect busy road signs, so people can get an idea of where they can go to reduce exposure. But we also have people monitoring out during the Saharan dust episode, if you remember that in April last year. This is the same area, same people, same routes. And what this shows is monitoring was carried out between 27th of March and the 3rd of April. And pollution started on the 1st of April, so the green levels there, the low levels, were taken before the pollution incident started, and dark red during the pollution incident. The darkest red there is in the Barbican Centre itself. We normally get really low levels of pollution there. So I think this is quite an important message for people to take away, that sometimes when we get PM 2.5 episodes, we can't actually do much about it, but it's an important thing to actually notify people so they can take an action if they need to. And thinking about the public health obligations that we have, some of the things that we've been looking at as an organisation, starting to think about how health and wellbeing tools can help the agenda, is we're thinking about how we design urban areas and whether they're designed in ways to reduce exposure. Where do we encourage people to spend time? Where do we put our benches? Do we put them away from busy roads? Where do we allow cafes to have tables and chairs outside? Is it appropriate, for example, for cafes on Bank Junction to have tables outside? I'm not sure if we should be encouraging that. Shopping areas, we encourage people to spend time in places to shop, and are there things that we can do with that? Can we pedestrianise at certain times of day or reduce traffic? Also, width of pavements, there are opportunities to widen pavements. For nitrogen dioxide, at least, there is quite a large drop-off from the actual exhaust as you actually move away from it, less so with PM10, but it can help. And then thinking about location of cycle routes, when we're putting cycle routes in, when TfL also put cycle routes in, are they in the best place? We have proposals for the cycle superhighway, you've probably seen those, and their suggestions targeting cyclists to use that particular route, haven't we? It's a tricky one, because I'm all for cycle segregation, but it's where we actually need space to segregate them. And are there opportunities through the planning process to design streets so that we can have optimum dispersion? We have problems with street canyons in urban areas. Are the things that when rebuilding is going on, should we be looking at how that's going to affect pollution getting trapped in that area? And another thing that we could think about doing was we've got London slums, we've got all the parks and all the squares where people spend time. Are there opportunities there to have low emission areas around those? Just so that they're more pleasant and clean places for people to spend time. This is why we're sorting the problem out. So getting over to the main point, which is reducing natural pollution. As we know, vehicles are the main problem, and diesel is fuel that is causing us exceed the national dioxide in the economy, and also there's high PM10 associated with that. We did some emission testing with King's College London vehicles in the city, and that showed us that emissions of NOx and NO2 for petrol vehicles are really very low. New petrol vehicles are really clean, almost as clean as electric. Euro standards, as Roger was saying, haven't worked for diesel vehicles and urban driving conditions, we know that. There are increasing amounts of NOx emitted as NO2, which is an additional problem, which is why we've seen roadside NO2 concentrations rising. There is a big difference by vehicle manufacturer. What we found in our vehicle emission testing at King's College is that certain vehicles actually are quite good in terms of emissions, and other vehicles are really poor. I've brought along a couple of reports that you might be interested in, which look at the emissions from Euro 6 cars. The first one's by the IAQM, and the conclusions in this are that on average diesel cars that are on the market at the moment emit around 7 times more NOx than they should. Although there are cars out there that do comply, and it's down to the technology, so down to the way that they're actually choosing to deal with NOx. I can give you details about if anyone's interested. There's also another report by Birmingham Institute as well, which looks at the same thing. So, turning to the solutions of vehicles, I think personally we need to move away from diesel. If you read the report, I think you will probably feel that it's not going to work. It's not going to be the magic word that we need. And I think that there's opportunities in London to use compressed natural gas for our larger vehicles, like we do on the continent and America. And also, we should really encourage petrol hybrid small vehicles. Petrol is, I can't stress it enough, it's a really clean fuel in terms of air pollution. And in terms of miles per gallon, I think the hybrid vehicles are actually quite good comparative to diesel vehicles. And that would be a solution in the short term. In the longer term, obviously we've got electric and hydrogen, but we're still not quite there with electric vehicles. It's still a bit resistant. So I would see that as a more long-term solution. I also think there's a role for lowering speeds to smooth traffic, get lower particulate matter associated with low speeds because you don't get the acceleration and deceleration in quite the same way. And the emission report that looks at Euro 6 vehicles picks out that there's a very high spike in NOx emissions when vehicles are accelerating. So if they're not accelerating as fast far away from traffic lights, then it stands to reason that NOx emissions should be lowered. And going back again to the report, I think at European level we should actually start to specify the technology required. I know there's a resistance to do this, and there's a desire to be technology neutral and just set a standard. But I think if the technology is not working, we need to start saying, if there is a technology that does, then I don't see why the European Commission can't say we've got to use that technology. There is obviously a big role for reducing vehicle numbers. Freight consolidation for the central London is an obvious one. We have a huge amount of freight. And more walking and cycling, that's always good. I don't think that would help the pollution level so much for central London because a lot of people walk and cycle already. And also, they will probably be coming out of public transport rather than cars on the whole. Our main problem is taxis and there's an opportunity for better use of taxis. Black taxis drive around hire around about a third of the time. They're empty in the city, and there should be things that we can do about that. And also, a point that comes up very regularly is, can we have better bus management? There seems to be a lot of buses under a lot of buses that only have one or two properly, and is there an opportunity to review that? So looking at buildings, in London now, the London Plan introduced a policy of air quality neutral developments, which I think is brilliant. I've seen assessments, it's very early days, but the assessments I've seen, what they're doing is allowing us to take into account the actual end use of the building and the freight and taxi use associated with that. So we're not just looking at building envelope now, so that's when that new buildings tend to be more efficient and have renewable source of energy. So if we just looked at that, and probably that would probably be sufficient to be air quality neutral from the previous land use, but it's taking into account the extra impact of vehicles visiting buildings. So any building with any uplift, which we're getting quite a lot in the central London, will not be air quality neutral. So there's different opportunities for us to mitigate that. I think I'm aware that the Clean Air has been revised, but I think that needs to be done in a way to deal with today's fuels. It's very much based on coal and oil still. There are some standard things that we should be requiring of all boilers, I think, in air quality management areas. There's no reason why they shouldn't be NOx over a certain size. It's no more expensive, they're very readily available, and it's quite an easy thing to do. And also I think we should have high chimneys. That doesn't always happen, but we need to disperse the pollution as much as we can. An issue for us that I think is on the horizon is the use of standby generators to create electricity for the building in times of heat demand. With all the threats of power outages at the moment, we keep seeing the media, I can see this potential problem arising. We have a large number of generators in the city, and they're all huge, and they all run on diesel. And it's not the relatively clean diesel that we have in vehicles and cars, it's city diesel. It's what they call white or red diesel, which has much higher emissions. On the energy policy side, we need to make sure that that supports our quality policy. This is something that's been bandied about for quite a few years now. Should we be encouraging CHP in urban areas as a role? We've got very high NOx compared to standard boiler. And also biomass and biofuels, are they suitable for air quality management areas? Another important thing that we're going to start looking at in the city is the impact of the predicted growth of London, central London. We've got a population at the moment in London of 8.3 million, it's going to rise to 9 by 2021, and 10 by 2030. And it stands to reason with all these additional people, all these additional buildings, all this uplift, we're going to have more industry, we're going to have more servicing, we're going to have more vehicles. So we need to take that into account when we're thinking the best way to ensure that if we're going to clean the reserve, it stays clean. So another thing particular to central London is we have a lot of demolition and construction sites, most of them very large. We try and control those by requiring the cleanest non-road mobile machinery, and we're trying to work out a way at the moment to get the construction companies to use the city diesel, which is more expensive than the red and white diesel, but it's a lot. I've got a report that's done by each university comparing generator emissions of the different diesel types, and it's actually quite a stark difference. Running the same appliance on different diesel. We try and get sites to get electricity on site as soon as possible. That's not always easy. There's demand on electricity in central London, but as soon as electricity is available, we don't have to use the equipment that's running on diesel. Obviously, we've got dust control measures, and we require no vehicle idling, and we also, at the city, try and reward innovation. We have our history contractors environment award, and that's for innovation in environmental and so we try and raise the bar with the construction industry continuously by getting the industry to tell us what they're doing and do the work for us, and then come to us, we reward them for it, and we'll put that into our best practice guidance very much. So just to summarise, and I think there's no quick fix to the London's air quality problem, but we need to be helping people to reduce their exposure now, because it is a significant public health risk, as you know. That's through both information and the way we manage and design our urban areas. We need cleaner fuels and technologies. We should not, in my view, go down Euro 6 route and think that that's going to be the answer to everything. It won't be. We need to reduce traffic numbers and traffic speed. We need an appropriate Clean Air Act. We could do a lot of positive work for that. Quite interesting, we've been doing work with city businesses, and there is a movement in the country at the moment for deregulation, and regulation seems a bad thing. Well, the businesses themselves do say to us, well, we need more regulatory powers. They acknowledge that we don't have many powers to actually make organisations do anything that they feel that we should have. And finally, as I said, we need to forecast for population growth, energy policy and power outages over the next few years. And if anybody has any questions or would like to consider the course, or anything, just drop me a line.
Thank you, Ruth. Okay, right. So you've heard from me as a representative of IAQM about the diagnosis of some of the issues and problems we face. Ruth's given us her perspective of some solutions, but we can talk amongst ourselves for as long as we like. It's really critical that we have elected representatives engaged, so I'd like to invite Joan Walley to come up and give us her perspective.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Roger and Ruth. And I suppose the first thing about any annual general meeting that you have is that it's not so much the actual presentations that you get, it's the opportunity to talk amongst yourselves and network and actually think about the last year and what you're going to do in your next year of your professional lives, really. And so what I'd like to say is that I hope very much that the subject that you've chosen and the discussion that we're having this afternoon will really, if you like, help galvanise the public debate, because I think all of us now really need to have in terms of air quality. And I appreciate totally that you are not a lobbying organisation, and it's very clear to me that you're a group of professionals who've got an enormous amount of expertise. And I think that it's just really very critical at this stage in the debate that we're having about air quality for you to find a way to actually get the discussions, get the debates, find the mechanisms for whatever vehicle it is that we need to be able to deal with issues about air quality. So in a way, that's my challenge to you to not lobby, because I know you don't lobby, but go away from here in the next 12 months and see how you can find ways, either with the private companies that you work for, or with the organisations, local authorities that you work in conjunction with, or whatever role you have with a residents group, or as a governor of a local school, or whatever it might be, find a way of actually getting air quality on the agenda. Roger, it was interesting that you talked in your introduction about the past air quality changes that we've had in policy. Now, I represent Stoke-on-Trent, and I represent Burslem, the mother town of the Potteries. And every photograph that you ever see of my predecessors, you have the smoke-filled potlands. And I've got no doubt whatsoever that the Clean Air Act came about very quickly as a result of the London smog. But it made an enormous amount of difference for people, my constituents, whose health, by the way, we still have a legacy of in terms of industrial disease arising from the air that they breathe. And I have to ask myself, if we could have a Clean Air Act then, and you mentioned in your speech as well the importance of getting lead out of petrol. And I remember when I was first elected to Parliament, I think 28 years ago, one of the big issues then was, could we get lead out of petrol? And I remember going to the Society of Motor Manufacturers, and they were, No way, because all the vehicle and licence use conditions, whatever the regulations are that control vehicles, they were all geared to lead in petrol. The pumps on the forecourts, they were all geared to lead in petrol. But there was a change. And sometimes you just find, and it's not a question of whether you can do something, it's a question of when. And I would like to think that with a little bit more of a sort of push and shove and understanding, we can actually get the changes that we need for what is effectively a long-term problem. No one's suggesting that the problems of air quality can be just turned around overnight. But we have to find some way of actually getting this push and shove to getting policymakers to change their mind on that. And I suppose really it's with that in mind that the Select Committee, which I'm chair in Parliament, the Environmental Audit Select Committee, and thank you for the evidence that you have given. But it's with that in mind that my committee has decided to focus on, amongst many other environmental issues, the issue of air quality. And as it was pointed out to me, I'm grateful to some of you for coming along and sitting in the public gallery of some of our committee meetings. And I mean, it might be the case that the discussion that we can have this afternoon could be a discussion that we never quite have in committee meetings, because there, as any Select Committee of the House of Commons knows, we are bound by formality. We have a process to go through. We announce an inquiry, we invite evidence, we take written evidence, we invite people to come and give oral evidence, we sit before our committee, and the public can't take part in any of that exchange. But what we've tried to do is to broaden the wider interest in the inquiries that we have. And I think on our current inquiry on air quality, we've done that a little bit. Members of my committee, we all wore, we were all wired up. We went up to Oxford Street, and we went to the GLA building, and we were told we couldn't have our photographs taken on the GLA building because we hadn't. I think we tried to get permission, but it was private property, and I don't think they wanted the air quality monitoring taking place quite there, so we were shooed off. We had our photographs taken somewhere else. We had our photographs taken in Oxford Circus, and then some of us were brave enough to have our photographs taken in our constituencies. And I think that the response that we got and the monitoring that took place, I think is part of how we can, if you like, broaden this wider public debate about what we're going to do about air quality. Because that's what it needs. And I think it's really interesting that over the lifetime of the Environmental Audit Select Committee, this is currently our third inquiry on air pollution. There's one in the previous Parliament, and there's one that we did shortly after the general election. And like you, Roger, we were concerned that there'd been no national policy since 2006 or 7. 2007. So where does public policy and public awareness, how does public awareness impact on that? And I'm a firm believer that if all the attempts by elected representatives and politicians, local councillors, European members of the European Parliament, if we've all failed to actually get this top of everybody's agenda, then we need extra weight. And one of our recommendations in our earlier report was that we needed a public awareness campaign. So I was really interested to hear what Ruth was saying about the public awareness campaign that you're involved in. And it just seems to me that it's going to need that public awareness to actually drive policymakers, people like, well, I was going to say people like me, but I'm just an ordinary backbench member of Parliament who happens to chair a select committee. But my select committee, if there's enough weight behind it, can put pressure on government. And that's why the inquiry that we're currently doing, with the evidence that we're taking, is part of a process to actually put the spotlight on the huge gaps that you so clearly identified in terms of air quality, Roger. So it's really, how does the evidence that we've received and the report which we shall be writing very shortly, very timely, this debate that we're having this afternoon, how can we come up with a set of even more robust recommendations than we had in our last report, which is going to be as relevant to people in London as it is to people in Manchester. We've had some people following our select committee report say, oh, it's all London-based. You know, there's issues in Manchester, there's issues in Sheffield. And I think there's a real sense that this is such a overarching multifaceted issue that it's almost the case that no single one body or organisation on their own can deal with it. And there's almost a sense that because it's so difficult, then we have to step back. And I think it's the job of my committee to come up with a set of recommendations that will have traction for not just the Cabinet, not just the Prime Minister, but local councils and those leading the negotiations in the European Union, where we can have even more of a leadership role, I would like to think, from the UK, in terms of what comes out of that ambition for 2030 and beyond. I think one of the difficulties is we're dealing with a long-term issue, and we're so used in our society now to short-term instant measures, to things only being on the agenda at one particular time because of some one incident. You know, it's very easy when we have the Sahara dust. Everybody will really focus on it. But what we want, when we come to formulate our recommendations in our select committee report, is a set of interlinked recommendations that will make sense to the Department of Business, that will make sense to the Department of Transport, that will make sense to those dealing with infrastructure planning, which will make sense to local authority leaders and residents' associations, which will make sense to the Department of Communities and Local Government. Because all the things that you mentioned, and in a way I had a speech prepared, but Roger's covered so many of the issues. If you go through all the key factors, you've got what's happening in Europe, the need to take a leadership role in Europe, what's happening about Euro 6, how is it going to be made to work, not just in the laboratory, made to work on the streets, in urban conditions. It is about planning. You know, you're absolutely right that the spatial planning, whatever it's called now, the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework, you know, it's anti-regulation, it's pro-localism. And in that set of circumstances, you cannot have a set of related activities all around the country. Because if you have no emission zones in London and not in Stoke-on-Trent, all that will happen is that the bus operators will take their buses away from one area and start polluting my constituency streets where we don't have a low emission zone. So it has to be interconnected. So we have an opportunity to influence European directives and to get us more stringent than it is. We have an opportunity to make not just the testing of vehicles, but the enforcement and monitoring after those vehicles are actually out on the road. We have to look at spatial planning. I think we have to stop this aversion to regulation. Businesses that I speak to, they don't see regulation as a cost and a burden on industry. I don't know what the CBI said yesterday, but they want certainty. They want to know if they're going to spend money on, and if they're going to innovate, and if they're going to research, what's the point of doing that if there's no access to the marketplace for there to be an opportunity for them to actually profit from that research, innovation and development? So all of this has got to be factored in. I think that the decisions that we make about diesel vehicles is going to be really a difficult one. I would think that, I'm not in a position to tell you what the recommendations of our committee will be because we haven't decided yet, we haven't had our meeting to decide that. But I think that we will be recognising that it's going to take time to move from where we are to where we need to be. But I think that we need to learn the lessons of places like China, where we're seeing that the work that they're doing on climate change, they're starting to match that and balance it with environmental protection safeguards as well. You know, we've got a lot of unintended consequences from trying to tick the climate change box and to start, you know, the global warming issues without having sufficient regard to what impact that will have on environmental protection issues as well. The issues about resources for local government are all important. I'm very proud, perhaps I shouldn't say this in this company, but I'm very proud, I'm in receipt of a lifelong award for the institution of the Chartered Institution of Environmental Health Officers for my work on public health. And I just feel that it's really important when you look at what's happened to environmental health officers and local councils, the way in which this austerity that we're in at the moment has reduced environmental health officers, that we have some way of being able to monitor, get the data, and that has to be done on a national basis. And audits of that kind, I think, is really, really important. So, finally, I just want to say just two things really. For me, it is about the public health impact. But if we know that so many premature deaths are caused by our failure to actually control air quality better, why are we not doing everything that we possibly can at the start of the process to actually prevent it in the first place? And I'm very grateful to the researchers and people at King's in London who have done so much research on this and who are urging us together to actually come up with solutions. And I just really want to leave with one final comment before we have the debate after my next colleague speaker addresses you, just to say this. Sometimes I think we've failed to get things across through our political structures. I mean, there's a big debate at the moment about, the next general election, who's fits or who isn't fit to be a leader. But it shouldn't be about individuals. It is about a vision of the kind of policy that we want to have. And I think there's a great distrust with elected representatives. Certainly for me, I try and do my part to the best of my ability. But, there is this issue about strategic policy making. And I think that we have to as well think about how we can get this message across using the arts. And I was proud to launch an exhibition at the House of Commons. It was done by a photographer who had a set of photographs. It was actually his son. And it was a photograph of his son breathing in and out, in and out. And it was displayed in lighting on St Thomas's Hospital, near to their department where they would deal with whatever the medical name is for lung disease, respiratory department. And this projection was there on St Thomas's Hospital, and you just saw this child's lungs breathing in and breathing out, with readings of the air pollution next to it. And I think that there are all kinds of ways through art, through photography, to actually communicate the real environmental problems that we are creating by our failure to act. So I hope that when we do have our recommendations published and the government responds, we will be doing something more to actually get this at the top of the agenda rather than at the bottom. I hope that in the run-up to the 2015 general election, political parties, and although I'm speaking here with my environmental audit subcommittee hat on, I am a member of the Labour Party, and I do feel that we are now working towards a clear policy on air quality. I do hope that will be taken into account as well, and I do hope that the discussion we have will actually help set the scene for the debate that we need over the next 12 months. Thank you.
We probably all have two like minds have a fierce debate, but I do look forward to the discussion. Our final speaker is Stephen Knight from London Assembly.
Thank you, and I'm a Liberal Democrat London Assembly member, and I represent the whole of London, but I'm also chair at the moment of the London Assembly's Environment Committee, and the committee is doing quite a lot of work at the moment looking at a big focus on this around air pollution, and in particular air pollution from diesel emissions. I've been an Assembly member since 2012, so I'm relatively new at City Hall, but I've been a councillor since 1998 in London Borough. And so I've sort of, if you like, been involved in environmental politics, if you like, for a number of years. And I think one of the issues around air pollution is that the understanding of the contribution of air pollution to health and the importance of tackling air pollution is relatively new, particularly amongst politicians, I think, the general public, even in a city like London, let alone in the rest of the country. And I think politicians typically, certainly going back 10 years ago, were aware of climate change as an issue and the need to reduce carbon, but certainly the importance of reducing particulates and, more recently, of course, nitrogen dioxide, the understanding of that, I think, is a long way behind. And indeed, an awful lot of what politicians did 5 or 10 years ago aimed at reducing carbon has actually made particularly nitrogen dioxide emissions worse And if you look at the way in which we incentivise the uptake of diesel vehicles in this country through banding, vehicle excise duty, through things like discounts on the congestion charge, and indeed some councils, including my own, I was involved at the time, set with reduced parking charges for low carbon emitting vehicles. All of those policies actually encouraged the take of diesels. And they were done for the best of reasons at the time, the best of intentions, but actually what we've seen is a huge rise in the number of diesel vehicles on our streets, and that of course has had implications in terms of air quality. So sometimes trying to tackle one problem make another problem worse. But I think it was in about 2010 that the Mayor of London first published formal estimates for the number of people in London killed or their lives shortened prematurely as a direct result of air pollution. And the figure was 4,300 odd people every year are killed as a direct result of air pollution. Well, I say air pollution, in fact it was entirely particulate pollution. And that's actually very important, so I'll come back to that in a moment. So that was 2010, and we're 4 years on from that. But still the level of understanding, I think, amongst the public and indeed amongst politicians of the number of people that air pollution affects and the health impacts of air pollution is still at a pitiful level. Joan's committee published, I think, your first report in 2010 as well, so there's a lot of work actually done in 2010 to highlight these issues. But just last year, Dodds did a survey. I've got a copy of the sort of findings here. Parliamentary perceptions. They did a survey of 101 MPs on their perceptions of air pollution, and the MPs were asked to rank in order the relative public health impacts of smoking, obesity, alcoholism, road traffic accidents and air pollution. Now I probably don't have to tell people in this room that air pollution is the second biggest killer to smoking. So it's a public health issue. But sadly, I can tell you the order that MPs put them in, and this is the same throughout all parties actually. I think the figures show that Labour MPs were perhaps slightly better informed than the rest, but it was very, very marginal. Basically MPs all got smoking. They got smoking. They understood that smoking was the biggest killer. The next thing they thought was the biggest killer was obesity, and then alcoholism, then road traffic accidents, then air pollution. This was 101 MPs, that's a pretty big sample out of 650. So the reality is that in April 2013, when this survey was done, members of Parliament simply do not get it. They do not get the relative health impact as we understand it now of air pollution. And as I say, I'll come back to the figures because I actually believe that the figures that are going to come out soon in terms of the health impact with deaths attributable to nitrogen dioxide pollution are probably going to blow the particulate deaths out of the water. So I'm going to speak predominantly about London because I'm a London politician, but I think most of what I'm going to say is probably applicable anywhere else, certainly in the major conurbations in the UK and elsewhere, but I think probably more broadly in most of the UK. So what has been the reaction in London since the Mayor of London published in 2010 this horrific figure of the number of deaths? Well, sadly it hasn't been good enough. We've not had an air quality strategy published. Some of us have been leading the charge, if you like, challenging the Mayor to do more. But sadly, most of the measures that were actually put in place over the last 4 years have been relatively minor. They've been concentrating on things like painting sticky paint on the roads to capture PM10 pollutions, things like planting a few more green walls. I think the Mayor ran a campaign to reduce engine idling and had virtually no. I think he launched a hotline, sort of shades of the traffic codes hotline from John Major's era. Boris launched a hotline you were supposed to call if you noticed a vehicle idling unnecessarily, and it turned out that they've had virtually no phone calls to this hotline, unsurprisingly. And indeed, recently we had a health display outside City Hall with a bus left idling all day, promoting London's health, in a bus outside City Hall, and that's left idling all day. So, there's an awful lot of words that have come out about this, but actually very little action. And shamefully, the current Mayor actually delayed the implementation of the low emission zone, the third phase of the low emission zone, in 2009, because he felt at that time that it was too big a burden on white van man and it would require them to update their vans, and that was too big a burden at that time in the wake of the financial crisis and recession. So I think most of the reaction could be characterised by quite a lot of rhetoric, actually very little action, and that I think is it's very, very, very unfortunate. Myself and a number of other politicians on the London Assembly have been banging the drum on these issues and trying to use every opportunity to try and promote the issue and raise it up the agenda. And one of the issues that I keep raising with the Mayor is we need to do more to raise public awareness. Particularly, we know we get episodes of bad pollution, smog days, high pollution episodes, etc. What are we doing to warn the public on these days? Because we've got formal health advice issued by the government that when the air pollution hits certain thresholds, people should avoid outdoor exercise and so on, and really take notice of these issues. The Mayor always answers this by saying, oh, well, I publicised the AirTex system. I think it was mentioned earlier. AirTex is a system which you can sign up to. They operate on Twitter, and they'll text you if you sign up to it. I checked just now. I don't know if any of you are active on Twitter. I'm a relatively minor user. I've been using it for a couple of years now, but I've got about 1,400 followers. I checked the AirTex system. It's got 500 followers out of a population of 8 million in London. So very few people, and indeed it's got a separate feeds for different parts of London, and there's a central London feed with 45 followers, and there's a feed for my own borough of Richmond upon Thames which has 9 followers in the AirTex system. So as a publicly funded warning system for air pollution, it's not doing the business, and I'll certainly carry on doing my best to encourage the Mayor and others to do a better job of informing the public. Another thing that I did last year was I did a survey of about 1,000 schools in London that were situated within a very close distance of a very busy main road. So in other words, we were talking to the most polluted schools about their attitudes to air pollution, their knowledge of air pollution, and what they thought ought to be done about it. And shockingly, the results of that survey showed that only 5% of schools near busy main roads are actually doing any form of air quality monitoring at all, or at least the schools were only aware of 5% of the cases of any monitoring going on in and around their premises. A lot of schools that responded to the survey, though, were very keen to do more when they understood the issue, and indeed many were keen to do things like consider having indoor games lessons if they knew there was a bad pollution episode and so on. But the reason I did this survey was more about raising awareness of the issue, because I think if we had monitoring stations on the school gates, so every parent dropping their child off on a busy main road could see what the pollution level was that day, then I think this sort of issue of air pollution could be raised up the political agenda faster than it currently is. And I think politicians are only human, they respond to public concerns, and we need to make sure the public are very concerned about it. Sadly, the reaction of politicians is not always a positive one. King's College have done a huge amount of work in London on measuring air pollution and studying the impacts of air pollution. One of their researchers went public at a seminar recently and said that Oxford Street was the most, or had the highest concentrations recorded anywhere in the world of nitrogen dioxide pollution. And this hit the headlines, and Boris Johnson responded with an expletive, said this was complete nonsense. I won't use the expletive because I used it in the chamber of City Hall and got into trouble, but Boris Johnson could apparently use it on Twitter without any problems. But the truth is this issue's in the messenger, because the truth is Oxford Street does have the highest recorded concentrations of nitrogen dioxide pollution of any monitoring station anywhere in the world. Nobody has found a monitoring station anywhere on the planet that's recorded higher levels. That's a fact. And you could argue, well, there aren't enough monitoring stations in Beijing or Moscow or wherever. But the reality is, we haven't recorded concentrations as high as Oxford Street anywhere else. And so as part of this debate, I published a report recently calling for Oxford Street to be pedestrianised. Incidentally, we also have one person knocked down by a bus or taxi on Oxford Street every 5 days, so there are other reasons for pedestrianising Oxford Street. But in terms of pollution, it is one of the most polluted roads in London, clearly, both for nitrogen dioxide, most importantly, and also for particulates. And I think we've got to stop shooting the messenger and taking action to reduce the emissions of pollutants. Otherwise, we're going to be in trouble. And of course, the trouble is coming down the tracks from the European Union, because we know that there's legal enforcement action, and we know that London, or the UK, and under the Localism Act, local authorities, the London authorities certainly, can be, devolve the fines for failure to act on these issues. And it's amazing how significant a difference it makes when you're facing legal action, because it's the threat of legal action, I think, is now finally starting to see this issue being taken seriously in City Hall. And certainly I had a meeting recently with officials who said that they were going to start enforcing local air quality management strategies with boroughs. At the moment, London boroughs have a duty to produce local air quality management strategies. They submit them to the GLA for checking. GLA says, well, that looks good, that doesn't look good. It doesn't really monitor what's going on. But apparently they're going to start, the Mayor of London is shortly going to start, there's going to be a consultation, I think in January about this, is going to start using tougher powers from the Environment Act to force local authorities to put certain things and take certain actions in those local air quality management strategies and monitor the output. And I think they're only doing that, in fact they're admitted to be they're only doing that because of the threat of legal action and threat of fines. Sadly, well, I suppose it's good that that's happening, but it's sad that it's happened to be done under the threat of fines. I think one of the issues for me is that I spoke about air pollution being a public health issue. If you look at public health strategies, you very, very rarely ever see a mention of air quality or air pollution. And as a local authority councillor, I base this in my own borough because councils now have to produce public health strategies. And the draft I saw didn't have a single mention, London Borough got a single mention of air quality in its public health strategy. And indeed, I raised this issue with Lord Darcy, who was recently chairing the London Health Commission, a commission set up to look at the health of Londoners. And I pressed him in a plenary session of the London Assembly, what are you doing about air pollution? Do you realise this is killing, over 4,000 Londoners and rising? This is the second biggest killer to smoking. What are you doing about it? And he looked at me flabbergasted and said, "Is it really? Good heavens!" And the report was published last week. I just want to read out a small excerpt from what he says in his final report. Alarmingly, London's air quality is killing London at a terrible rate. As a doctor, I was shocked to discover that every year 4,200 Londoners die as a direct result of air pollution. That's 7% of all deaths that occur in the capital. Acting to reduce emissions is expensive, but failing to act comes at a terrible cost to lives lost and quality of life degraded. Having examined the evidence, I am compelled to conclude that London's clinicians must also become London's environmentalists. And I think getting the medical community to understand air pollution and understand, not just the specialists in air pollution, but getting doctors to become advocates around the issue of air pollution and the health impact of air pollution is extremely important, because they're a big lobby group and they don't understand it. I suspect their understanding is probably equivalent to that of MPs. In other words, they just don't get it. Hopefully, with reports like this being published by Lord Darcy and other things, we will get there. In London, we have seen proposals for an ultra-low emission zone from 2020. Interestingly, the Mayor coming up with a proposal which his successor will have to implement. In other words, he will leave office in 2016 without any action, leaving it to his successor. When it was first announced, I thought it was probably too little, too late, for those very reasons. It only covers the central London zone and it only comes in 2020. It now appears that at the time we were told, when it was first announced, that it would limit central London only to very low emission vehicles, zero emission or near zero emission vehicles. Of course, now what's happened is those vehicles can drive in, but anyone else can drive in with a £12 daily charge. So in other words, a 40-year-old diesel bus or lorry, can just come in for a £12.50 daily charge, and you know, for me that isn't an ultra-low emission zone worthy of its name, and it's certainly not as far as other cities have done. I mentioned earlier that my committee is doing an inquiry into diesel pollution at the moment, and I put to the Society of Motor Manufacturers, who Joan referred to earlier, a question about should motor manufacturers selling cars have to produce a traffic light system, like you get on, you know, the food you buy, telling you the salt level and fat level and all the rest of it. Should car manufacturers have to put on their adverts, you know, particulate emissions, nitrogen dioxide emissions, carbon emissions? They have to put carbon emissions now, but they certainly don't have to put pollutants up there on the advert. And of course, the Society of Motor Traders said, oh well, we all have to meet Euro standards, so there's no need. Now we know, of course, Euro standards aren't working. They haven't worked, and there's a huge difference between vehicles, even amongst those that meet certain Euro standards. But the most important thing that came out of our session, which was last week of the Environment Committee, was that, and I mentioned, I'll come to this later, was that we're going to see very shortly figures published for the number of, an estimate for the number of deaths attributable to nitrogen dioxide pollution. And what I'm told, what the committee was told, was that the health impacts of nitrogen dioxide are roughly equivalent to the health impacts of particulates, as we understand, the sort of impact it has on the individual. But the number of people affected by high concentrations of nitrogen dioxide are significantly higher than the number of people affected by very high concentrations of particulate. So the likelihood is that we're going to see figures showing that nitrogen dioxide is actually killing significantly more people each year, even than particulate matter is. And that, if you put those two figures together, you're going to see deaths from air pollution probably overtaking smoking as the single biggest killer. And for me, I think that will be, and I hope that gets very wide publicity when those figures come out. I'll certainly do my best to make sure that we get very wide publicity around those figures. For me, that could be a game changer in the public's understanding of this issue. I hope it is, it needs to be, and I hope that we can do more. So, we've got a huge task. We've got a huge task in terms of cleaning up particularly diesel emissions, and as was said earlier, I think perhaps the time has come to say that we don't want to see diesel vehicles on the streets of our urban areas. Certainly, it could be a different case in rural areas, but certainly where you've got high concentrations in urban areas, I think there may be a case for saying no diesels at all as soon as we possibly can achieve. But that does lead to some really big problems, not least, of course, the European motor manufacturing industry has really put all of its investment eggs in the diesel basket for the last decade or more. Indeed, here in London we've got, I think, the largest diesel development and manufacturing plant in Dagenham, Ford's in Dagenham. So there's huge amounts of investment gone into the diesel engine, but sadly, we know even with Euro 6, diesels are producing significantly more particulate matter. And I was even told last week that of the very small particulate matter, the PM2.5s, diesel exhaust has a very high concentration of black carbon, which is much worse in terms of lung damage and health impacts than other forms of particulate, small particulate pollution. And so I think there's more, we need to worry more on our understanding of the impacts of particulate pollution will no doubt grow. And I think we certainly need to not take the eye off that ball. And finally, on that issue, we were also told that the newer petrol engines with direct injection technology, designed to be more efficient than the old petrol engines, are actually more like diesels in the way they work, and therefore produce more particulate matter than the standard forms of petrol engines. So we constantly need to be on the back of the motor industry to make sure they're not, by trying to solve one problem, they're not making another problem worse. But of course there are other issues in transport. We know there's an ongoing fashion now in posh areas of urban London to have wood-burning stoves in people's homes, and it'd be interesting to know whether that is contributing significantly to particulate and nitrogen dioxide pollution as well. So I think there are a number of areas, and I could go on to a whole range of other areas, but most of the focus of our critical moment is around diesels and transport. So I think if we can sort out transport emissions, then we'll be a long way to solving some of the real problems facing the health of Londoners, and not just Londoners but Europeans more generally.
Okay, right, well, there you are. I think we're all pretty much agreed on the scale of the problem then, and some of the diagnosis of the problem. It's time to open it up and explore some possible solutions. So our speakers should just migrate to the chair. I will facilitate questions and discussion. Who's going to be first? Celeste. I thought you would be. What would you like to say?
It's a question for Joan. I mean, this is your third combined air quality. What makes you think you will have more impact this time than you did in the previous 2 times?
Well, I think, should we stay here, aren't we, sorry? I think the point about any select committee is that we have to do what we can on behalf of Parliament to hold government to account. And so we simply did a third inquiry, the second one in this Parliament. We did the first one, we made our recommendations, and a bit like Boris's London air quality report, really, you know, the things that the government kind of acknowledged that they would accept were so minuscule that we thought we'd just at least return and see how far they've got doing what even a little bit that they said they do. And in order to actually keep it on the public agenda, because we just feel it's really important. It's a public health issue, it's got to be sorted. So will we have any more? The very thing about doing an inquiry, I think, helps it to be flagged up. And I think there's far more awareness as a result of our inquiry, not exclusively our inquiry, but it's part of that process. So we're just keeping the pressure on, and we will, hopefully, the next Parliament will keep the pressure on, so we'll see.
Peter?
Yeah, I just wondered whether we're talking about trying to get public opinion. Does public opinion follow the press, or does the press follow public opinion? And, you know, obviously as politicians you must be used to this sort of thing. I know a little while ago some of us had phone calls from the Sun newspaper about the dirty diesels and all the rest of it. And they'd obviously got, that was the thing for the day. They weren't interested in anything else. Do we actually need to be talking more to the Sun and other newspapers rather than just the public opinion as a way of getting the message across through the media, or is it just that they're just going to follow their own?
I think there are two sides to this. I think one aspect of this is that, you know, who are the paymasters of the press, and, you know, who pays their bidding, and so on and so forth. But that aside, I think it's always worthwhile to do what can be done to educate those who are in positions of influence of one way or another. And so, for example, during my tenure as chair of the Environmental Select Committee, we have built up a series of contacts with the press, the environmental correspondence, the political correspondence, and we've had at least now a 2-year, well, twice a year, we have a little kind of reception to one of our committee meetings, which we invite people to. And you know, we're looking to, you know, do what we can to make sure that the information is there. Then, of course, there's a whole thing about social media as well, which, I mean, I'm not, I actually don't tweet. I know I should, but I spend all my time tweeting, I never actually do any work. But I mean, you know, it's very, very, very frustrating when it's just like one incident, you know, that might be a volcano ash or something like that, and suddenly the spotlight is on it. It's like, you know, you're a surfer and you're out there in the water and you're waiting for a big wave to come. And when it comes, you've got to be ready for it with all your, you know, all your expertise and everything. And it shouldn't be like that. We should be dealing with environmental public health issues in a strategic, planned way in order to deal with issues. You know, we shouldn't have to be doing our damnedest to actually get this particular kind of emphasis on it.
I think there's a sort of understanding amongst some of the environmental journalists I think probably what there isn't is an understanding amongst the health journalists and the general news staff of the issues. I think the media sort of see a good story, and stories driven in the media tend to be very immediate. So it tends to be about a person knocked down by bus, somebody stabbed. Regional news especially seems to be about people stabbed and broken glass. And the problem is, of course, air pollution is the silent, invisible killer. And it doesn't mean it's not killing people, it's killing people faster than anything else, but it's just silent and invisible. And it's very difficult to take somebody who's just had a heart attack or a stroke and say, that person has died or had a heart attack or whatever, as a direct result of air pollution. It's, the correlation is definitely there. We know that people are dying at that rate from the pollution, but it's very difficult to show a human side of the story at a human scale of because the news are not really, journalists aren't interested in statistics, basically. They never have been, never will be. If they can put a human face on there. Yeah, exactly. They're interested in what sells newspapers. So you've got to find a human face. And so you do sometimes get news stories. The UK being taken to court by the EU is a news story. I think we just have to use whatever hooks we can to get this issue up the agenda and get more and more people to understand it. So every time that something comes up, there's a spat over Oxford Street, it's another excuse, another reason for me to talk about air pollution in London, and Joan does. And every time a report's published, it gets a bit of coverage. So I think we need to carry on publishing reports, we need to carry on raising it, carry on speaking about it, because we're getting there. I think people are vastly better informed about this now than they were 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. So we're not getting there anywhere like fast enough, but we are beginning to get there, and I think we're going to get there much faster. It's going to accelerate as time goes on.
Do you think that we as a society and individuals have an ownership of this problem? I mean, it's very easy to see it as a problem created by somebody else's diesel car, rather than what you may be doing in terms of contributing to, say, transport, or in your example, burning wood because you didn't want a bit of wood burning.
Well, I think there is that, and we have seen a huge take-up in diesel vehicles. And the irony, of course, is people thought they were doing the right thing environmentally buying a diesel because, of course, they had lower carbon dioxide emissions. And you saw, the entire motor industry badge their eco vehicles as diesels because they had the lowest carbon emissions. They got cheaper entry into central London. They got cheaper parking in some places I mentioned earlier. They've got much cheaper road tax and the rest of it. So, and actually what that does show you is that public policy can drive change, actually. It's just it drove it in the wrong direction in this case. And what we need to do is rapidly turn public policy into driving change in the right direction. So it does work, but I think there is an issue, and there's a big difference between the motor manufacturing industry in the Far East, who for 10 years now have been producing petrol-electric hybrids. The Prius, the Toyota one, Honda have done it, Nissan are now building electric cars here in the northeast, and the European motor industry, which has focused its attention on trying to make more efficient and better diesel engines. And yes, they've got very efficient and very good diesel engines, but they're just fundamentally dirty. It's a dirty fuel, and it's a dirty engine. It's impossible to make a clean diesel engine. Actually, it's the fundamental problem. But the whole industry has put all its eggs into that basket for so long. It's going to take a long time to turn it around.
Can I just ask Satiri's representative of Public Health England, if you could offer your perspective on public health and public view.
Thanks so much. I think Public Health England has recognized the importance of air pollution, and recently done a lot of work on air pollution, including the publication of the Public Health Outcome Framework Indicator for air pollution, for particular air pollution. And we also published a report on the mortality burdens of particular air pollution at local authority level. And currently you have a high-level objective and to do something about the impacts of air pollution and try to reduce these 25,000 deaths attributed to particulate air pollution in England. And we'll be talking to stakeholders, certainly the Institute of Management, politicians. We made a submission to the Environmental Audit Committee on their part of the inquiry. So we're very active in this area. And we want to know how we can best help local authorities and other stakeholders to reduce the impact of that pollution, by reducing exposure, by informing public health professionals, the medical professionals on air quality related issues. And I'm also wondering what else can be done apart from raising awareness, apart from providing information. What other practical advice or impact assessments or tools would be useful for their quality management community and more broadly for stakeholders or businesses trying to reduce their impact?
I would say that the general public take notice of what their doctor tells them above what their MP or their councillor or even environmental campaigners say to them. And if people really understood the health impacts of air pollution, then you would see huge demand for action. And you've only got to look at the role which the health profession took in the campaigns about smoking and advertising of cigarettes, in the current debate around obesity and alcohol. You know, the health profession has been at the forefront of all those public health campaigns, driving for policy changes, whether it's banning advertising. You know, we haven't seen a ban on advertising of diesel cars, have we? You know, I'm not suggesting that's necessarily the answer, but you know, we need to see some very, very dramatic policy changes, and we need to see them driven by the health messages, I think, because you know, as I say, the public take health far more seriously than they take general concerns about the environment, or certainly what a few low voices amongst the political community tell them.
Can I just like to know, I think one of the difficulties is that if we had all of that going on and medical professionals having a part to play in it, that's all very well and good, but it needs to be part of a much bigger, wider set of policy initiatives as well. So it all has to be going on at one and the same time. And one of the things that worries me about the public health aspect of it is that the health and wellbeing boards, they seem to be, in many cases anyway, I can't speak for the whole of the country, but they seem to be as much in a silo as other decision makers as well. I think it's really important that the health and wellbeing boards start to really engage with the local enterprise partnerships, that they start to engage with where the investment decisions are being made. And it comes back to this national guidance, because you know, we've got today this major road building programme announced. You know, we've got a whole set of government initiatives coming out of government which are contradictory. And you know, one of the things that happened was when the government abolished the Sustainable Development Commission, which was meant to be the place in government where some of this information could be filtered through. And you know, the balance taken as to how you actually came up with policies that weren't contradictory. And I would refer you back to an earlier report that our committee did on the scorecard report. There really has to be, at the very highest level of government, as well as what goes on at a local level, and there has to be some way of actually getting the right balance in terms of policy initiatives going forward. Because so many policy initiatives might be good for one thing, but they then create a whole load of unintended consequences and problems. That's going to be costly, not least to the NHS. And I think that needs to be factored into the work that's going on inside the Cabinet Office. I think Public Health England could really be taking this up with the Cabinet Office. You know, there's a lot of talk from the Prime Minister about GDP. Well, are we going to carry on just measuring GDP in terms of economic outcomes? And I can tell you there was 1 month last year when we had, I think it was either bad weather or there was a strike on the oil tankers, and GDP went up. Everybody said, great. It went up because people stocked up their tanks of petrol in advance of there being a shortage. How is that improving the GDP? We've got to include health and well-being. And there are some initial discussions going on inside the Cabinet Office and NHS and Public Health England should be part of those to get a different, wider definition of what we mean by well-being. So we're not just looking at outcomes that are actually, you know, causing the injury and protecting the planet.
If I can just add, from a local authority perspective, what would be useful for Public Health England to do is something I covered in my presentation, and that's advice on urban design. To date, local authorities have only had to reduce or help to reduce concentrations, which haven't really looked or been charged at looking at exposure. With the new public health responsibilities, it's not entirely clear what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to do it. We are starting to think about it in the city. I think a very useful thing we should do is look at what we do, what powers we have, how we can influence it through our planning processes, through transportation, through urban design in particular, something I'm looking at, but what the opportunities are for exposure reduction.
And I think there are lots of things which local authorities could do outside of their responsibilities about measuring air quality. You know, it tends to be, as Joan said, very done at a very siloed level. But local authorities do lots of other things. So, for instance, school green travel plans. How many of them encourage people to walk by routes that don't include busy main roads? So, in order to lower the exposure for small children, well, actually, very few of them, if you look at them, have measures in there to try and reduce exposure of children travelling to and from school. How many local authorities, or how many local authorities do we see through their planning policies trying to discourage schools, nurseries being built next to main roads, or these housing developments next to main roads,
Or great big shopping centres.
or shopping centres, or anything next to very high levels of concentration? And where you do see developments next to main roads with high levels of concentration, where are the requirements for air filtration systems on those buildings? I did visit a school actually in Tower Hamlets, I think, where they were putting air filtration system on the air going in. But that's a brand new building and they could do it. But actually, there's a huge job to be done for the thousands of schools in London that are directly situated on very busy main roads. Given the health impact that we now know, that children being educated in those schools are suffering in terms of their health, there must be a huge case for filtering the air that they breathe on a daily basis.
David, I think you're next in the queue.
Right. 2 points actually. One, I would totally endorse the comments so far as general practitioners and also nurses in general practice, because the awareness so far as I'm concerned and of the health effects of air pollution there is negligible, and as you say, that is usually people's first point of call, and again the health and well-being boards need to be made aware of the extent of the problem, so that we can get a proper joined up approach between the air quality people in the local authorities and the health professions. But the main point I was wanting to comment on was, and I was very encouraged towards the end of the presentation, to hear black carbon bit mentioned. And black carbon is arguably one of those pollutants that, if it's dealt with, it can aid the public health impacts of black carbon, but also addressing black carbon is one of the more effective short-term ways of reducing the impacts of climate change. The other side to that is that there are also the other ultrafine particles, again not in regulation, and possibly an issue that would bring a degree of extra confusion to people that you're starting to mention these. But there is also the question with particles: are certain size fractions or certain compositions responsible for some effects, such as the chronic health effects, and are other fractions responsible for the short-term acute effects, such as asthmatic attacks? it's something that I raised a year or so ago at the Cranfield conference, and it certainly the audience there didn't reject the possibility. So it is one of those things that maybe we need to think about further.
I'm certainly dealing with diesel wood historic like this too, like the particles. Yeah. Anyone want to comment before we move on?
I think it's a point well made.
Yeah, I think it's very. I mean, I was only really aware of the contribution of black carbon last week when it was first mentioned to me, but clearly it is a hugely important, given how much worse it is than other forms of particulate matter, and given that it makes up 80% of diesel PM2.5s, it's clearly a huge issue, which we need a greater understanding of.
Yes, and the sad thing is that very few people seem to be doing any work on black carbon and ultra-fags.
I wonder, Chair, given that we have somebody here from NHS England, I wonder if I can just tell a little personal anecdote. My mother had a stroke about 2 years ago, and thankfully she's recovered very well. But I remember very well, the forms that the doctors sort of filled in at the time. They asked about do people smoke, do you consume alcohol. She doesn't smoke nor consume very much alcohol. They measured her, fat levels, all the rest of it, body mass index, and various other contributing factors to look at, what the things were. Nobody asked her whether she lived next door or lived on a very busy A road, which she does. Nobody asked that question. And I don't know whether surveys have been done to look at incidence of stroke and heart disease in relation to how close you live to a busy main road. But those are the kind of things, maybe it's the survey forms that doctors fill in that the NHS produce need to start asking these questions and recording the data. I wouldn't mind betting actually that may, I don't know, but I wouldn't mind betting it was a contributory factor in that case or in many other cases.
I think there's probably a large body of epidemiological evidence about various health outcomes and proximity to births.
If doctors start asking those questions, then the public would start worrying about it.
Yes, I think probably what I'm saying is that I think we understand the association reasonably well, we can quantify it, but it's that link back to recognition amongst GPs, etc. Right, I'm going to go to Nigel and then Jack.
Hi, I'm from the Sussex Authority.
You don't need a microphone, do you?
No, I don't. No, bad enough. I think it's interesting because we were talking about those 5 areas that politicians were surveyed about, road accidents, obesity, smoking, pollution came down the bottom, of course. It did seem to me that we're at a stage where we've got a lot of health evidence behind us. We've done a lot of monitoring. We sort of know what's going on where, what levels we're at. We've got the ideas, and from a local authority perspective, it's very hard for us with resource levels diminishing to get out and do green travel plans and implement, make sure that planners are doing what they should be doing and trying to implement sort of things. It's quite restricted. But I get the feeling that a lot of these things have come to where they are now, like obesity and smoking, through campaigning. And it does make me think that we used to have, well, there still is EPUK, which is the old National Society for Clean Air. And does the Institute maybe need to work with EPUK to bring back a campaign force, really? Because we have got the evidence. We are engaging on with Public Health England to talk about what the issues are, and we're trying to get through. We've got a lot of evidence, and the EAC has got that evidence, and we know what's there. And one of the recommendations you say is more promotion. Should there be something stronger as a campaign body pushing this now? Because you look at where these things have got to on the political list about road traffic accidents, obesity, smoking, it's because there's a lot of campaign of, authorities or campaigns, British Lung Foundation, all these other things are campaigning about people with COPD and asthma, all those major campaigns, but there's nothing for air pollution. Are we missing something?
Well, in London summer, but you might disagree.
Well, okay, there's one of them. And he's done a lot. I must say, there's there's lots, but we are, you know, we're talking about silence, we are working something.
This is all about having a voice.
It's about having something, pushing it politically as well. So,
do we have
my
to
tip.
Well, I do think it's important that there is a voice, and you know, nothing gets done by accident. Nothing gets done really without there being pressure of one kind or another. And I was just thinking, which was the body that was scrapped when the government scrapped the coalition government scrapped
The Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Exactly, thank you. The Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution isn't really years back. I mean, you know, we have lost many of these august bodies in that way. And, you know, what's there in their place?
I think I'm inclined to, sorry to argue with Jack, but you know, what are Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace doing on this? They used to be major campaigning forces as well. Unless their will or interest in their focus
in certain areas.
Yeah.
They've given very robust evidence to our committee.
That's great. But I think probably nice one is they may be a bit diffuse and some focus is needed on this issue. Sorry.
Can I just come back on that?
Very quick, Sarah.
Yes. This, sorry, Sarah, I'm also Vice Chair of Environmental Protection UK Air Quality Committee. And we have been at BP UK have been trying to get together kind of groups of organisations to try and spearhead a bit more of this campaigning work. So, watch this space, because we have been in something we have been in.
Very good, Sarah. Jack, your turn.
Probably one for you, Joan. The vehicle manufacturers sort of do cycle beating with Euro 6 and all these other Euro standards because they can. And last week we heard from America that the Hyundai and Kia were fined $100 million, plus another $200 million in carbon credits for overstating, misstating all the emissions. Why couldn't that happen here in the UK? The Americans are prepared to tackle them about lying about the emission standards. Why can't it happen here?
I have to say that I'm not an expert in the whole way in which the vehicle emission standards actually work, operate, but I would be very interested to look into that further. Very interested. If you could just let me perhaps have a paragraph on that, I'd be really interested.
It was in the Telegraph and the Times all last week. But yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Surely, Jack, the hope for that's going to be, it's a little bit indeterminate yet, which is a problem, when it comes to the in-conformity testing for the Euro 6 directive, which hasn't been ironed out yet, rather annoyingly. But there is a kind of mechanism in place, but it remains to be seen what the European Commission and others will actually do about following it up.
They've never had any fines for missing the previous Euro standards.
No, but the previous Euro standards never tested in use. They were type approval limits. The new Euro 6 has an in-conformity testing 2 years down the line. So there is a kind of mechanism to deal with it, but it remains to be seen what the follow-up is if it's shown that vehicles aren't performing.
I'm Paul Braithwaite. I've been an activist on this, mainly in Camden for the last 7 or 8 years, and where I came in was my personal health and concern with morbidity. And I understand that the media are most concerned with the 4,300 deaths, and the government is concerned to say, oh, it's only taking 6 months off your life. That takes in everybody in Northern Ireland, Wales and Cumbria. So the problem for us inner Londoners, and I started as a cyclist, cycling every day in Camden and Westminster and Islington, and I noticed I was wheezing and coughing and not terribly healthy. And I went to a top guy in Harley Street, and he said, well, you're cycling in town every day, what do you expect? So I don't think that there is enough awareness of the actual day-to-day effect on people's quality of life. I think we've had enormously constructive contributions from 4 heroes here this afternoon. I was pleased to hear Simon Burkitt get a well-earned name check, and I think there are other heroes. Obviously at King's College, the 3 professors have there done absolutely stunning work, and Client Earth. I started a study in Camden Council 6 or 7 years ago, looking at communicating with the community the dangers to help. And what I found was that when I wanted to address asthma, there was no data being collected by GPs that was helpful. The nearest thing was how many puffers were being prescribed by each surgery. So I think that was a good point about what data is actually being collected that Simon made. But I think my conclusion is, yes, we need a mass communication campaign, and that DEFRA have been, I don't know what's worse than asleep at the wheel, but have for years and years been the villain and been awful, and it should be them that is driving the bus on a mass communication, multi-million-pound campaign of public information. So, end of rant.
Okay, nice. Starting with passion.
Can I just quickly comment on our comments there? Many years ago, when I was involved with the Hearts and Beds Network and Air Alerts, we attempted to put promotional materials explaining about health with the puffers when they were given out by the chemists. And we thought this would be a really good way of reaching a target audience and passing on information about what was going on with air quality, current air quality, through an alert. And the response we got was, how much will you pay us for us to be putting the leaflets in with the puffers? And that's always been the issue of trying to get information out to the public, is actually how much we want to go and talk to doctors, how much will you pay for our time to speak to us? And it's a real negative to actually getting that information out to the people that need it. And there's a lot of very positive work going on, and it's been very nice to hear King's College getting name check a couple of times this afternoon. But it's something that we constantly struggle with, is there's no finance to push through getting this information out to the public.
Yes, that's clearly a major barrier. Yes.
Hi, Gavin Thompson from Client Earth and the Healthy Air Campaign. Actually, a campaign of charities and public bodies, as was alluded to, that we need, but unfortunately the sum total of the staff of the Healthy Air Campaign is represented by me, so a similar problem to what was just discussed. A huge lack of resources. I just wanted to share with everyone, Client Earth have a legal case against the UK government for breaches of nitrogen dioxide limits, and the UK Supreme Court ruled last year that the UK government was effectively breaking the law, but referred a couple of questions to the European Court of Justice, and that verdict will be on the 19th of November. I just wanted to share that, because we had a discussion about the media and looking for opportunities, and that will definitely be one, so that's next week.
Okay, yeah, great, we'll look out for that. Right, have we begun to run out of steam then? Oh, Peter, this I'm good for a comment.
Just a quick comment. I was glad to hear that we're now going to, that NO2 is going to become towards the surface. We've always had, from a monitoring point of view, we've always had a problem that PM2.5, PM10, black carbon are really not very well defined. They're actually defined by the method that you're using to measure with them. At last, we have something to concentrate on, which we know is a nitrogen atom with two oxygens attached to it, and we can clearly define it. My other comment, which was a bit of an offhand, as one of the people who tried to stop EPUC from NSCA being turned into EPUC, I'd now like to campaign for EPUC to be turned back into NSCA. Right. Because I think that time must have come.
You better say that to another forum. You're quite happy in here. Great. Okay. Well, it is nearly 4:30. I think that's roughly when we decided we'd close proceedings today. So thank you for attending today. I found that very valuable discussion. Thank you particularly to our three speakers for contributing and giving us time this afternoon. I hope that stimulated you to take some messages back into whatever communities you represent. And yes, I look forward to seeing you again at the next IAQM meeting, which, for those of you who are keen dispersion modelers, is on the 2nd of December, ready for the DMUG to 2014. So, thank you very much.